All right, here we go. I'm going to pick up right where we left off. Kip proceeded to rake the leaves from the remaining holes, and Bertrand watched but said nothing. Finally, Kip reached the last of the graves, the smallest one, Penny's sized. "There's one for each of us, sir. The tree's waiting until we're too sick to move, too sick to fight back. And from the look of you and your family, that won't be long." "No, no, 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 no." Master Windsor shook his head from side to side like a child in denial. "It doesn't make sense." He turned towards the tree. "It's not the way it works. The doctor must have done something. He must have provoked it or threatened it or—" His voice fell silent as he saw the giant branch that had broken from the trunk. "Who did this?" he said, his voice colder. "It was an accident. The doctor was helping us make a trap and—" Bertrand spun around. "He what?" A new panic flushed his face. "If you hurt the tree, if you even talk of hurting it—" "Then what?" Molly cut him off. "We end up like Crouch?" "Quick or slow, it's the same end for every person who comes here." She could feel her blood rising, her heart pounding in her ears. "I know you think your tree's a miracle, sir, but that same tree puts bodies in the ground." And she gestured towards the hills covering the lawn. Bertrand turned around, staring at the graves, and his lips parted. Molly could not tell from his expression if he had known before that moment what lay beneath those hills. She watched his shining gaze dart from mound to mound as if searching for something. She suddenly realized that not all of the bodies in the ground were strangers. Not to him, at least. "Your ma and Da," she said. "They're out there, aren't they?" "I never saw it." He shook his head at a loss. "On the night when it happened, I was in my room. I remember hearing my parents arguing in the hall. My father had changed his mind about the tree. He thought it was making us sick somehow. He wanted to cut it down or poison it. I don't remember. What I do remember is the storm." He set his jaw. There was no rain or thunder, only wind. It shook the entire house like it was inside the walls. I could hear my father shouting downstairs and this inhumane sound like someone or something was down there with him. My mother came into my room, her eyes. She was so frightened. She pulled me from bed and told me to run and never come back. I was young. I didn't know what to do. His voice was shaking, but not with fear. She helped me climb through the window and I fell to the ground. I called to her to jump, but she was gone. He stared into the empty air, his dark eyes shining. Molly at once recognized the horror on his face. It was the expression she had worn when her parents pushed her onto the lifeboat and disappeared. It was the shame of someone who had survived. She cleared her throat. "If you hadn't run, you'd be buried there with them," she said. "Your ma, she wanted you to live, to eat and sleep and breathe and laugh, to meet your wife, to have your children. Running's not a bad thing, sir, as long as you're running towards something good." Bertrand's face crumpled. He sank to the lawn, his head in his hands. "We can't leave. This house is all I have left. There's no money, no credit, nothing. And Connie, why, she's too sick to travel." Molly stepped closer. "The creature that buried your folks is coming back, sir, tonight. It's time to choose." She held out the old key. "You can take this, go back in the house, and wait for your miracle, or you can come with us and live." Molly opened the door to Penny's bedroom. "Are you finished, miss?" "Finished? I've only just started." Penny sat on the floor of her room, an open suitcase before her. It was overflowing with stuffed animals and toys and blocks. She held up 2 dolls, one in each hand. "I can't decide which one to keep." She looked between them and then threw them both to the floor, exasperated. "Why are we even leaving?" "Your father thinks it's best, and I'm inclined to agree." Molly wandered through the room, collecting an assortment of clothes for the girl's journey, which she placed over one arm. She passed over the most beautiful dress. Instead taking clothes that could stand the most wear. She didn't know where Master Windsor and his family would end up living, but it would likely be no place for frills. Molly knelt down next to Penny and began repacking the suitcase. "But what if I don't want to leave?" Penny asked. Molly removed most of the toys to make room for Penny's clothes. "I thought you hated it here, miss." "I do hate it, only there's some things I don't want to leave behind." Molly removed a stuffed bear to find a stack of Princess Penny books. The gilded pages shone bright even in the shadows. "Things like these?" The girl nodded. She touched the topmost book, picking at its corner. The cover was adorned with a bright picture of the princess battling an ogre who looked surprisingly like Alistair. Molly put a hand on the girl's shoulder, looking her straight in the eye. "Miss Penny, there are better stories in the world than these." The girl looked like she might cry. "Like your stories?" Molly winked. "On a good day." She gently removed the books from the suitcase and set them on the floor. Besides, the dolls might want something to read. And she closed the case, latched it tight, and led Penny into the hall. The rest of the house was in a state of complete disarray. Since deciding to leave, Master Windsor had become a man of pure action. Perhaps fearing that if he didn't leave quickly, he might lose his nerve. He had spent the last few hours rushing from room to room, collecting what essentials they might be able to fit on their carriage. A reluctant Alistair trailed behind him, helping when necessary. Molly went outside to check on her brother, who had been given the job of preparing the wagon for their journey. She found him in the drive, hoisting a large metal canister onto the bed of the wagon. There were several other canisters, all of them different, some of which she recognized from the kitchen. "What's all this?" she said. Kip wiped his hands on his trousers. "Lamp oil, axle grease, turpentine, lard, even a bit of brandy." "You planning to cook something?" "Sort of." He steadied himself on the wagon, trying to keep off his bad leg. Molly looked around for his crutch, but once again could not see it. "I know we cannot hurt the tree, but I think we can make it harder to reach. If we take down the bridge, it'll be a long time before anyone comes near here again. The wood's too thick to cut down, but I think there's a better way." He tapped a canister. "As soon as we cross that bridge with the family, I'll pour every drop of oil on the beams and light the whole thing up." Molly looked at the rows of rusted canisters. "You sure this isn't about just making a giant explosion?" she said. Kip grinned. "That too." By late afternoon, the family was packed and ready to go. Bags and trunks lined the foyer. The last step was Mistress Windsor. Constance had regained consciousness, but was still too weak to move on her own. Molly entered the bedroom with Master Windsor and Alistair to find Constance clutching her chest with panic on her face. "Bertrand," she sat up. "My ring!" Master Windsor rushed to her, clutching her hand. "No, my love. No more rings." He stroked her brittle hair. "We're getting you out of here. We're going someplace safe." Molly saw Alistair out of the corner of her eye. He was watching his parents, and his usually scornful look had given way to something more complicated. He bit the inside of his cheek as if calculating some difficult sum. Molly glanced out the window. The red sun hung just above the crest of the valley. She put a gentle hand on Bertrand's shoulder. "It's nearly sundown." Master Windsor let go of his wife and stood. The bed frame was too wide to fit through the doorway, and so they decided to carry Mistress Windsor separately from her mattress, which would have to be turned on one side. He carefully lifted her into his arms while Molly and Alistair dragged the heavy feather mattress out into the hall. Master Windsor walked behind them, whispering to his wife as one might whisper to a child. By the time they reached the foyer, she seemed to have fallen unconscious once more. Bertrand gingerly lowered her onto the mattress, which Molly and Alistair had placed in front of the stairs. Molly helped Bertrand wrap blankets and around his wife's frame. "If she doesn't make it," he said, touching her sleeping face. Molly heard the sound of a horse approaching on the drive. "That'll be Kip with the wagon." Bertrand stood up, a suitcase in his hand. He lingered in the middle of the foyer, his eyes drifting from the walls to the windows to the ceiling. One final look at the house he had grown up in. "I don't think I'll miss it," he said. "You'd be surprised," Molly said. But then she added, "That still doesn't mean you should stay." Bertrand walked to the front door, took the handle, and opened it. "Evening, Governor." Bertrand let out a small shriek of alarm, dropping his suitcase. Molly looked up to see two men propped against the doorway, one improbably tall, the other unusually squat, both reeking with the unmistakable odor of the city. Mr. Figg and Mr. Stubbs stepped into the house, eyeing the shocked family. Stubbs grinned. "Going somewhere?" And with that, we have to stop.